Everybody wants that crystal ball. They want someone who will tell them, this is the LSAT practice question to study. These are the sections that you should focus on. This is what's coming on your test. And for years, there were some people who claimed to have that LSAT crystal ball. Not perfect predictions, of course, but enough they could reasonably feel confident in their recommendations. But today in 2026, that LSAT crystal ball is gone. It is shattered because LSAC changed the conditions that ever made prediction possible in the first place. The first big factor in removing the ability to predict the LSAT is the fact that full LSAT practice tests were leaked internationally through organized cheating operations. And so for LSAC, predictable reuse of those exams became a security risk. And so LSAC responded to the cheaters by reducing the reuse visibility and increasing randomness in their administrations. And once they introduce randomness, that breaks the ability for anybody to forecast or predict what's going to be on the LSAT, which means that any crystal ball predictions or forecasts are now structurally impossible. Let me say this carefully and plainly. LSAC is aware that full LSAT's entire exams, not just individual questions, have been leaked because the LSAT was hacked. And these were complete LSAT test forms circulating as paid products by organized cheating networks in China. And because that happened, LSAC had to stop reusing those test forms in full because, of course, if a leaked exam is reused in any predictable way, the problem isn't just that some people have an advantage, it's that every honest score becomes suspect. It problematizes the integrity of the exam. And LSAC, of course, is entrusted to protect the credibility of law school admissions. And so they don't really care whether LSAT crystal ball prediction webinars are convenient. They want to eliminate the conditions that made prediction possible. And so for that reason, the crystal ball has had to die. It is irrelevant now going forward. Now, most students think that LSAC has made the exam harder, and they have, but they also, more importantly, changed how the LSAT is built. They have a much heavier reliance in 2026 on brand new content. They are including more experimental sections directly into scored portions of the LSAT. There are fewer fully intact, fully reused sections. There is less visible continuity between LSAT administrations, and we're seeing random curveballs like, for example, the change to reading comprehension that happened on the January LSAT, where some people had full reading comp sections that did not contain any comparative or dual passage. Excuse me. And so, crystal balls or predictions only work when LSAT test reuse is stable and visible, and LSAC intentionally removed both the stability and the visibility of that reuse. And so you cannot predict what is designed not to be predictable. LSAC is engaging in structural randomization to remove the predictability of the LSAT. So for example, in reading comprehension without any forewarning, without any advance notice, LSAC changed reading comp for the first time in almost 20 years. Now going forward, some test takers receive a comparative or dual passage and others do not, even for the same administration, even on the same day. And that single change destroys one of the oldest assumptions in LSAT prep, that the structure of the LSAT is both fixed and knowable in advance. And so if your prediction, if your crystal ball is assuming that comparative passages will always be there, it's already wrong. LSAC has shown they are comfortable trading uniformity of the exam in favor of security of the exam. And predictions depend on three different assumptions. First, that tests are reused in recognizable ways. Second, that structure is consistent across test takers. And third, that historical frequency predicts future appearance. Now, all three of those assumptions are now unstable. Once LSAC limits test reuse, they hide the signals of that reuse and they mix things up. They introduce structural randomness intentionally. Forecasting becomes impossible. It becomes random guessing wrapped in confident but irrationally so. And so language. And so Predictions are not just inaccurate, they're also misleading. And despite all of this, the tendency to think you can peer into a crystal ball and predict the LSAT is, of course, tempting because it promises relief. It says, you don't need to master everything, just study what's coming. And that feels efficient, but it's unreasonable to do so because LSAC is able to uniformly, of their own accord, change things up without any prior warning. And of course, if you make 10 different predictions, maybe 5 of them are going to hit. Doesn't mean you're good at predicting, means you got lucky. If you make enough predictions, you can highlight the valid ones that turned out to be right, and you can sweep the invalid ones or wrong ones under the rug. So a valid prediction does not validate the method. We have to consider to what extent are you selecting for your wins and masking the failures. In other words, there is confirmation bias. So the question isn't, do predictions ever work? The real question is, do the predictions reliably improve the performance of test takers under uncertain conditions? And unfortunately, the answer is no. Nobody predicted that LSAC would stop including comparative dual passages for some test takers. Nobody could have known that in advance. Nobody could have predicted, for example, that LSAC would fail to announce that in advance, and so some folks were just thrown for a loop. And so reading comprehension is not testing only topical knowledge. It's testing whether you can read precisely, whether you can track viewpoints, whether you can predict the structure of the passage in advance. None of that is known in advance. You got to be able to evaluate the passage in the moment. My point here is that even if your crystal ball predictions guessed the topic of a passage in advance, it's not going to help if you don't have the skills to interpret the passage in the moment when you read it. And so once reading comp structure itself varies by test taker, predictions collapse completely. Reading comprehension is forcing you to deal with what's there in the moment, not merely what you expected. Now, of course, logical reasoning predictions are something that people often try to engage in as well, like there are going to be more flaw questions, more strengthened questions, more abstract reasoning, and those labels describe half the section. So again, they're meaningless predictions. You've got to think about, what is the argument actually saying? What supports it? Where's the gap? And why does this answer fail exactly? Predictions train categorization, but the LSAT rewards your reasoning abilities. And predictions can often backfire because when you're chasing predictions, you skip sections that seem irrelevant, you delay your practice waiting for better material, you overdrill narrow categories that are underrepresented on the actual LSAT, and you feel prepared, but you're not able to adapt. And so all of this creates brittle confidence that will collapse the moment the test deviates from those predictions, which now it does regularly more often than ever before. The test doesn't care what your predictions said. The clock doesn't care. The questions don't care. What matters is the student who walks in calm until the section doesn't match your expectations. And so now they're not solving questions. They are negotiating with reality. If you've trained the skills, you're going to be able to stabilize. But if you focused on predictions and on crystal balls, you're going to spiral. Now, most students actually retake the LSAT, which means even if predictions helped you once in the past, they're going to collapse over time. If your prep only works when the test behaves predictably, it's just gambling. And so what can we do going forward, given that the LSAT is less predictable than ever before? We've got to focus on the skills, which means you're going to do real sections from previously administered LSATs consistently. You're going to review deeply using a method like the Socratic review method. You're going to track your personal recurring errors, and you will train your ability to adapt deliberately. And so if your prep is working, you should be able to explain why a wrong answer is wrong. You should be able to adapt when something unexpected appears. You should be able to recover mid-section after you've been thrown off. If not, there's a problem with your fundamentals. And of course, the LSAT has not become more difficult in a significant way in the next year, but it has become harder to predict on purpose. LSAC has, by necessity, had to respond to real threats like the organized cheating networks, the leaked exams, the pattern exploitation, by breaking the conditions that ever allowed crystal ball prep to exist in the first place. That era is over. And it could actually be good news for you if you're training the right way. Because the LSAT you're taking doesn't care what you predicted, it cares about what you can do with what's in front of you on the screen, and that is something you can train.